to Faculty Voices. Pablo Pérez Ramos is an assistant professor of landscape architecture in Harvard Graduate School of Design. Today we'll be talking about Oasis of Mezcal, a Oaxacan rural community in conversation with Harvard. Welcome to Faculty Voices, Pablo.
Thank you very much, Eunice. My pleasure to be here today.
You're originally from Spain. Could you tell us a bit about how you became involved in this project in Mexico? Indeed, not just Mexico, but very rural Mexico.
Yes, my involvement in this project began with my contact with Lisa Silva. She's a Venezuelan architect, and she was a former colleague at the GSD back in 2018. That's where I first met her. She still comes mostly every year to teach a course at the GSD. So Lisa came in 2018 with the support of Memo Chavez from the Resin Foundation, and Memo was a stakeholder in a mezcal production company. So for a few years, since 2017-16, Elisa and Memo had been systematically cultivating an enduring relationship with the inhabitants of Agua del Espino to help this rural community in Oaxaca incorporate some reforestation and water harvesting strategies in an agricultural landscape where monocultures of agave for the production of mezcal have been proliferating recently. So although the climate in Oaxaca is generally humid, the Central Valleys, the region where Agua del Espino sits, it's a region that has a very distinct and long dry season with an increasingly shorter wet season. So these climatic conditions were making the land very vulnerable to processes of erosion and degradation, more so in the context of climate change. So the proliferation of these monocultures of mezcal were just aggravating the risk for land degradation. And since I had been involved for a few years in the study of agricultural landscapes in conditions of extreme in North Africa, in the fall of 2020, they approached me and we decided to apply together to this Mexico Innovation Grant from the David Rockefeller Center for Latin American Studies to give this project more traction.
So you went from working on North Africa to Mexico. When was the first time you traveled to Agua de Espino? And could you describe your very first impressions?
Yes, my first trip, well, the application was in the midst of the pandemic. So we had to wait until March 2022 when all the limitations for travel at the university were finally lifted. So yes, my first trip was in March 2022. And Memo and Elisa had organized a wonderful agenda for me to get familiarized with the culture of Oaxaca. They gave me an opportunity to familiarize myself with the food, to see the different forms of local craft work around textiles, wood carving, ceramics, etc. And then the first day, after 3 or 4 days moving around the state of Oaxaca, we finally went to Agua del Espino, and it was very fun because it was during the day of the local festivities, like the most important day for the celebration in the community. And it was an incredibly immersive experience for me to see all the rodeos, the local musical bands, the dancing, the singing, the popular food, the ways in which people, kids, teenagers socialize in these rural communities. And of course, it was my first encounter with mezcal in Agua del Espino on that very same day. So that was also an opportunity for me to begin to familiarize myself with the physical geography of the region, with the landscape of Agua del Espino, which is characterized by an undulating terrain that has hills and little valleys where the vegetation concentrates, and then most of the hill slopes are degraded and more arid. So it was the first opportunity to begin to get a sense of what was the landscape and the physical and the social conditions that we were going to encounter during our work.
You talk about how the production of agave, the source for mezcal, is changing the productive model of the community. Could you describe the problematic effects for this community and similar communities?
Yes, so there's been an increase in the appreciation of, it's a distillate of agave that has a very long history in the region. But there's been an increase in a recent interest in this spirit in the global north, let's say. So the Central Valleys, the region of Agua del Este, are now the target of international investment, which is trying to enter the mezcal business. So there is the local community perceives that there is pressure, that they have something that the global market is interested in. And they understand that the increased cultivation of agave can help them, in a way, get rid of an economy that has been historically based on subsistence agriculture. So now they understand that there is something that they can cultivate that can be exported and that can help the economy of the region. The international pressure, the global recognition of mezcal represents an opportunity for these communities to move away from an economy of subsistence. But unless there is the implementation of new landscape management practices and new business models that allow this transition to happen in a sustainable way, there will be an expansion of land dedicated for the monoculture of agave that will result in, perhaps more human development, but at the expense of higher land degradation.
Okay, but you have here a product, like I'm thinking about coca in Colombia, even though mezcal obviously isn't illegal, that produces more per square foot than corn or the normal products. So have you faced pushback from the community or members of the community who want to use all the land for mezcal?
No, I wouldn't say so. I think, there's the community on the one hand is interested in increasing the production of agave, but on the other hand, many of the members of the community understand, or they can actually see with their eyes, that the growth of the land dedicated for monoculture is really problematic. They can see how with climate change, the dry seasons are more severe, the wet seasons are shorter, so they can see how the rates of aggravation of the degradation of the land is increasing over the past few years. So they understand that they need to introduce sustainable practices that don't come from abroad, sustainable practices that have been common in the region for a long time. So there has to be some sort of hybridization of these traditional practices with the production of with a larger scale of production of this particular crop.
So, working with the community, what have you and your team been able to accomplish to improve the situation?
So when I jumped into the project, I think there were already a few strategies that were under development. I think the title of the grant that we got from the Mexico Innovation Fund was reforestation and water harvesting. Those were the two main vectors for intervention. There was, on the one hand, the need to introduce tree canopy in some of the most degraded lands. Like the trees provide shade. Shade protects the soil, the moisture that enters the soil. If the soil is more humid, then there will be more chances for vegetation to grow under the shade of the trees. Once you establish some sort of a ground cover, then the soil is protected by the vegetation that it produces. So there's some sort of synergy between the soil and the life it produces. I like to think of the soil as both the precondition and the consequence of life. So, there's this interesting feedback. So there was a reforestation plan that in some cases didn't succeed, because once you introduce the little saplings, you have to also introduce land management protocols so that the goats, for example, which are very aggressive, don't enter the lands that have been recently reforested, and they don't feed on the little trees that were planted. So, there were a few errors. There was it is a trial and error exercise in many ways. fundamentally based on water harvesting. There's a wet season that is short, but it rains. There is enough rain that the goal of the water harvesting project was to extend as much as possible the access to water over the dry season. If there is no retention of the water just runs down along the creeks into the river and it disappears from the landscape. So there was an exercise of trying to introduce a few basins for water retention that would help, for irrigation during periods of severe drought, for the cattle to be able to access that water in the areas where they graze, and for the replenishment of the ground. So these were the two main strategies that were already in place, and we have been able to, with the help of the grant that we got from the Mexico Innovation Fund, to dig some of these water basins that are currently in use. And there were also elements that we introduced about regenerative agriculture, as I was saying before, the introduction or the reintroduction rather of some of the traditional practices would be the three main vectors of the intervention: reforestation, water harvesting, and regenerative agriculture.
Yeah, I'm curious when you talk about traditional agriculture and you talk about the community, how involved are women in Agua de Espino?
That's a good question. Most of the farmers that we work on when we go out into the fields around the village are male. They are the big majority of them are men, but we have been involving women in the experience mainly through the elementary school teacher who offered us the opportunity to use the soccer field, which belongs to the school, to create a nursery and to introduce a part of the reforestation. There was an activity that was to involve all the kids into the plantation of 1,000 little trees in the periphery of the soccer field. And through her, we met some other women that work in the community. One of them is the owner of a local shop, but she has like a little terrace, like a little courtyard for people to hang around or to drink a beer or to have a sweet. And she has what we consider to be the most successful oasis, let's say, in the village, like an area, like this little court that she has completely covered with thousands of little plants in little pots, very, very beautiful. And that implies a huge reduction in the temperature and creates an incredible sensation of comfort, of thermal comfort in an otherwise very, very dry and hot village. So we have been able to work with some of the women in the community in understanding about their interest in the kids and in the future generations, and also interest in the care of plants at a very local scale.
Pablo, you're a landscape architect. This sounds more like a project for an agronomist, or for that matter, a geographer. What do you bring to the table as a landscape architect?
Yes, I understand. The question makes sense. The nature of this project is multidisciplinary. One of the teams that we have been working with is INSO, means the Instituto de la Naturaleza and Sociedad de Oaxaca, so the Institute of Nature and Society in Oaxaca. In this team, there are biologists, there are agronomists, forest engineers, soil experts, and of course, when we get there, we also include, obviously, the knowledge brought about by all the local farmers and people, members of the community that we work with. But the Elisa is also an architect, and I am an architect and a landscape architect. So I think the field of landscape architecture introduces into this project the possibility of developing some sort of holistic perspective to land management that allows us to integrate ecological, social, and economical factors. But in landscape architecture, we also work with ideas about ecological design. Like we can design landscapes that in a way are inspired by the functional principles of local ecosystems that can be very useful in the introduction of some of these regenerative agriculture techniques that I was mentioning before. And site analysis and planning, one of the exercises that was mainly led by Elisa, was the production of a holistic map of the region based on the feedback that we received from the local farmers, so they know which parcel belongs to who, but they have never seen the full territory that belongs to the town from a planimetric perspective that allows them to understand holistically or structurally, let's say, the organization of that territory. So, we were able to produce some of these maps that offer them like a new view of their own land.
Mm-hmm. In 2021, you received a Mexico Innovation Grant from Dr. Class. You developed strong local and Latin American partnerships. So, what's the role of these partnerships and what role do they play going forward?
Yes, I guess what I would say in answering this question is that my incorporation into the project comes after a few years of both Elisa and Memo building an enduring relationship of trust with this community. It's interesting to see the role of the outsider. I'm not an expert in ethnography, but I come as an outsider. And in order for me to be able to work in a project like this with these local partners, it was absolutely necessary and very interesting to see how these intermediate partners, in this case, Elisa and Memo, had been working over years to build the trust that is necessary for somebody coming as a total outsider and their voice being heard and considered by the local community. So once those relationships of trust have been established and solidified, it is very interesting because then the seed has already been planted and things begin to grow. So now it is much easier to continue to develop the project because the connection already exists.
Mm-hmm. Many of the professors I know here at Harvard, when they complete one successful project, they move on to other themes or they try to replicate these projects in other geographical areas. So you've chosen to dig in deeper by extending your experience to the Harvard community and increasing the synergy developed with Agua del Espino over the years. So, what's the importance of these conversations? Who are you bringing together, and what do you hope to accomplish?
Yes, I guess here I would mention the event that we are hoping to celebrate in the spring of 2025. After the fieldwork that we've done over the past 3 years, we want to bring some of the members of the community of Agua del Espino to the GSD. We want to bring them to Harvard. We are eager to extend this experience between us from Harvard and then from Agua del Espino to the Harvard community. Until now, it's been only Elisa and I who have been there, and we want to bring them here. So we would like to invite them to speak about their experience in person and to foster conversations with Harvard faculty and students. The community members, we are hoping they will share their invaluable insights, their traditional knowledge, even their spiritual relationships with the land. And our intention here is to produce an intimate roundtable where farmers, the students, the faculty can engage into some sort of reciprocal learning through informal conversation. Traditional lecture-based teaching, we believe that this format will create a non-hierarchical and collegial learning environment that the students at the GSD are always eager to make connections with members of these local communities which have the on-site and the hands-on knowledge. So again, we see this event also as contributing very deeply to the construction of this relationship of trust. If we can demonstrate to the local community that some of the members can come here and share on-site their expertise and their knowledge, once they come back, members of the community who perhaps are still a little bit suspicious about our work there, we are hoping we'll get more and more people from the community on board and that the work could gain even more traction.
So, in other words, it's both a way of building knowledge and it's a kind of validation.
Yes, the word validation is very important there. I don't know if I used it, but that's a key word.
So, what sort of faculty are you hoping to reach out to, Pablo? You mentioned, for example, the spiritual dimension, which is something we hadn't talked about. Are you intending to get the divinity school involved?
No, I mean, honestly, the way the event was presented to the grant, to the call for proposals was involving primarily faculty from the TSD. So that's a very good point, and I will take it. We are not even sure whether the event will be possible because we are struggling a lot to get visas for these people who have been, most of them, illegal immigrants in the US in the past. So, an interview at the embassy takes years to actually get scheduled. It's been really difficult. But if we finally make it, I'm asking for extensions to Sol Carbonell and people at the administration of the Rockefeller Center to try to get an extension to see if we can actually celebrate it. But if we do, that's a very valid point. I would like to involve people maybe from other departments that can engage in conversations that are not necessarily about landscape, but about traditional forms of knowledge and spirituality and material culture and all different kinds of knowledge.
Your project seems to be highly unusual because at one important level, it's focusing on agave growers and agriculturals and others in a very small community. And on the other level, it's taking on worldwide challenges. In an article you wrote, in the face of the current climate crisis, the frontier of extreme aridity is shifting and expanding into areas of the world that might soon require the knowledge and technology embedded in these cases for centuries. Could you talk about the implications, particularly in terms of Latin America as a whole?
Yes, well, this project has to do with aridity. The title was Oasis of Mezcal. So we were trying to transport some of the ideas about oasification, which we could consider a term in opposition to desertification, like how to bring higher levels of life at levels of abundance and complexity that would otherwise not be possible in these arid lands. So there is, on the one hand, a long history in the colonial representation of the hot desert as an empty sea of sand. This is a result of a colonial attitude that can be also extrapolated to arid lands in general. The colonial discourse would go like, arid lands are arid because the people who have historically inhabited these lands didn't know how to cultivate, did not take appropriate care of them, and so they degraded to a point of irreversibility. Okay, that is definitely not the case. Like there's people who have been inhabiting arid lands for millennia, and they have been using very particular forms of knowledge that have allowed for this coexistence to take place over many long periods of time. So what we see, and especially in the extremely arid lands that I've visited in North Africa, is that it is possible to actually thrive in conditions that would be considered impossible by many. So in the context of climate change, we're going to see how the frontier of extremely arid lands is going to expand in many ways. So lands that are now semi-arid might become arid in the near future, and lands that are simply arid will become desertic in the near future. So I think it's critical that we understand how humans have been able to thrive in this context using technologies that are traditional, that have allowed them to establish a sustainable relationship with these environments over long periods of time. On the one hand, it's based on very local forms of knowledge and local forms of technology. But on the other hand, we see across the global south that there are redundancies between local forms of knowledge across similar environmental conditions. You know, even if the knowledge is local, it's trying to respond to an environmental condition that is not necessarily exclusive. So it is interesting to see, you know, in how in Mesoamerica, in this case in Oaxaca, in North Africa, or in South Asia, we see similar landscapes that are the result of local forms of knowledge that are trying to respond to very arid conditions. Not sure if this was good enough, but anyways.
Okay, well, one last question. I'm sure our
Yes.
readers are wondering, do you like mezcal and do you have a favorite type?
Yes, I do. I like mezcal. I actually like it a lot. I have to say I mainly drink it when I am in Mexico, when I am in Oaxaca, because they offer you the mezcal that they keep for themselves, you know. But I brought some mezcal here. I have to, I am not a very, I don't have a lot of experience. I like it, but I don't consider myself an expert at all. But of the mezcales that I've tried, I would say that are probably the ones that I've enjoyed the most. But sometimes they give me other mezcals much drier or much stronger, and I have to say that I've also enjoyed them. It's hard to believe how a spirit that is so strong can actually work so well.
Is there anything else you'd like to add?
Not really. I mean, other than thank the David Rockefeller Center for Latin American Studies for their continued support over the past few years and their current support, and what I hope will be an extension of this project over time in the next few years. So this is a project that is far from being done. It's in many ways a pilot experience that we would like to give continuity and that we would like to extrapolate to other communities similar to Agua del Espino, which are facing very, very similar challenges. So thank you very much for the interest and the support.
This is Faculty Voices. You've been listening to Pablo Pérez Ramos, an assistant professor of landscape architecture at the Harvard Graduate School of Design. Thank you, Pablo.
Thank you very much, June.